nuances in the industry, but for this conversation, I want to keep it as simple and light as possible. What I want to do now is go into some of the data around what we're seeing as far as population, as far as through the intersectionality of gender and race in the industry, as well as gender, race, and the intersectionality of gender and race. Because it's not always as clear or as simple as, well, we are able to retain, or our attrition rate is for this population or gender. Because as we see the intersectionality of gender and race, then the intersectionality of gender, race, and parent or caregiver have different attrition rates, right? Because how the current workplace is set up, as well as different barriers, hinder and often push out other certain intersectionalities of people. And so we'll get into that as well. And so I really, really want to focus on some of what we're seeing and not really delve into why. Well, we can delve into why, but also as part of that, understanding where we need to go. So when we're looking at, let's start at the executive level. And when we're looking at the top 10 companies, and I didn't pick these come from industry standards. The top 10 engineering construction companies, we're looking at Bechtel, AECOM, Fluor, Jacobs, Kiewit, Turner, Sanskas, DPR Construction, Gilbane, and Mortensen Construction. When we look for what percentage of their executives are Black, we're getting a range of 2 to 6%. What is really interesting is at the larger the company is, or the higher up they're ranked, the smaller the percentage of Black employees that are at an executive level. And then about midway, it starts going up, and you see 4 to 5 to 6%. The same thing pretty much with Latino. They're between 2 and 5% of their executives identify Hispanic or Latino. And then what we're seeing is 0 to 3% for Indigenous or Native Americans in this group of employees. The highest percentage of Native or Indigenous people is at Mortensen and Gilbane at 3%. And Mortensen and Gilbane also, out of executive level specifically, have the highest number of Black employees at executive level, as well as Latino/Hispanic employees at executive level. They're both at 6% for Black and 5% for Hispanic/Latino, and then 3% again for Indigenous. And so they may be doing something, or maybe the data skewed, and we have to look at it a different way because they have maybe smaller amount of employees, but it's definitely an opportunity there to see what they're doing that others may be able to benchmark when it comes to retaining talent and having your executives at that level. However, we talked about what numbers they have at that level, but not necessarily looking at what numbers of their executives actually leave, right? And so oftentimes we're talking about the glass cliff effect and defining what the glass cliff is. So I'll get into the glass cliff um, once we touch as we go through, because I want to stay on the executive level right now, because if we can have a more diversified executive level, which actually has voice and power in an organization, you generally see how it changes the demographics at lower levels in an organization. When an organization is not at as diverse in the equity level, executive level rather, you will see it changes, it impacts what it looks like throughout the organization. Um, and so when we look at the attrition rate just for Black employees, and I want to do Black employees. Hold on, give me 1 second. Yeah, because we can do Black employees and then we can do Native, Indigenous, and look at the attrition rates as it relates to the executives, the percentage of executives. Bechtel, which has 0% of executives in at indigenous people at executive level, actually has the highest attrition rate at 17%. However, they're not the only one that have zero indigenous or Native Americans at the executive level. We also have Floor and Kiewit. So it's not necessarily Floor. When I look at, they have 15% attrition rate, and Kiewit is still at, yeah, so Kiewit is still a little bit lower than them at 13%, even though they have zero. So it's not directly correlated, but you can see there could be some impact, and that would have to be really delved into more within an organization. When we look at engineers across the spectrum, we're still seeing, of course, unfortunately, still lower numbers of Black engineers, Hispanic engineers, Latino engineers as well. This also is, while we've seen more Black women enter civil engineering specifically, they have the highest attrition rate out of the EC industry at 16%, which is twice the rate overall for engineers. Engineers overall is 8%. Latinas are not that far behind at 13%. So there are some issues going on in the workplace where we're seeing attrition rate for Black women engineers at a much higher rate than we're seeing overall that really must be addressed. One primary reason is the industry is short right now and reported to be short for the next 10 years, year over year, 25,000 civil engineers. You and I know, or maybe some of you don't know if you're not in the industry, you don't become an engineer, an EIT, and a PE, professional engineer, overnight. So over in the tech space, they want to get some developers. So you go to a boot camp for 3 or 6 months. Because we do work in infrastructure, it takes more time to actually get an engineer into college. It takes a hell of a lot of work to get them to finish the degree. Then they have to sit and take the fundamentals engineering exam, go out and practice under a licensed engineer for 4 or 5 years before they can sit to take the PE exam. And so it's really important that we understand the value and the time and the impact this really has. Because if we're losing, the attrition rate for Black women engineers and Latinas are 16% and 13%, we're losing, and this is within the first 5 years. So some of them may have been at the point where they could have set for the PE exam, they could have been already EITs, and they leave the industry completely. And so it's really important that we take a look and understand how it really impacts the industry. And while we talk about what that looks like, because we do a lot of infrastructure work in engineering construction industry, being short 25,000 engineers when we have the grid to work on, right, or energy, power, when we have water systems that we need to maintain and upgrade and change out. In a lot of areas, we're way behind. We have roadway that needs to be updated, bridges, dams, levees. We do not have enough engineers right here. And people are like, well, we can bring in immigrants, and that is part of the solution, right? But if organizations are not willing to have conversations as to why the attrition rate is at 16% and 13% more, twice than they're seeing overall for engineers, is relates to Black women and Latinas, we have we will continue to have this problem. The additional cost to bring in immigrants, get them green cards, is now passed on to US citizens when organizations are not doing the work they need to do in order to retain the talent. So let's back up for a moment and look at what goes on in the workplace as far as on the executive level. And I really want to talk around a specific phenomenon called the glass cliff. So, the glass cliff is a phenomenon in which women and underrepresented people are disproportionately placed in leadership positions that are more likely to fail. More likely to fail. And oftentimes, this is done to show and prove certain types of people cannot do this work, should not be in leadership and management roles. When they're given less budget, fewer team members that don't have the experience and expertise required to do the work, they are not getting the right equipment to even succeed. So it's really important for organizations to look at how they are supporting people of color, but Black, Indigenous, and Latino specifically in the workplace. And what does that look like? Are they getting the same support, sponsors, mentors, the same budgets and resources as everyone else in that organization? Because otherwise, they have literally been set up to fail. And so when we look at Black, Latino, and Indigenous employees, they're often placed in leadership positions that are really challenging and risky or riskier. As we know, engineering construction does have a lot of risk than their white counterparts. And these can be due to biases. Some people call them unconscious. A lot of times they are very conscious. Tokenism. There's like, hey, we have a Black man here, we have a Latino, we have a Latina, what for tokenism. And then they're given no support in the role, cut out from meetings and decisions and people telling them how to run their own projects and departments as opposed to letting them making decisions, but all of the failure falls on them. And so it's really important to assess how you and create systems and processes that are equitable in your organization as relates to executives in the engineering construction industry. If you have found what I always find interesting, not always in the engineering construction industry, is that for underrepresented employees, they have to have all of these qualifications that their white counterparts don't. Like they have to have the engineering degree and the PE, and some of their white counterparts do not in order to be in these roles. And so making sure that the qualifications are standard across the board to qualify for those roles. And that way you aren't limiting and cutting out people because you're giving them additional barriers that they have to cross to meet unnecessary and biased standards, right? And so it's really important to assess these processes and procedures you have in your organization when it comes to promotion and recruitment. Because if they are biased and people like, well, how do we know if our recruitment process is biased? Having somebody do somebody externally doing an assessment on your recruitment process helps. One of the things that because we do, one of the services we offer here at Positive Hires Diversity Recruitment, oftentimes we are brought in months after the diversity recruitment process. We are brought in to do diversity recruitment after the role has been open. 90 days after a role has been open and you're getting in a candidate and you're trying to push them all of these interviews at once, it is generally not to your benefit, and also stretching them out over time as well as not to your benefit. But what happens is the hiring manager may find somebody in those first 90 days, And now you're pushing it out for another 30, 45, 60 days to diversify your talent pipeline. Include diversity recruitment at the very before you even start the process. Sit down with whoever's doing your diversity recruitment or your recruitment overall and ask them what is their plan to be sure they have so many people in the talent pipeline. Because if you don't do it before in the planning process, even when it happens and they're in the process of sourcing the candidates, it often gets overlooked, or we'll get to it later because they're already in the process. And once you're in that they don't often want to change until they get to a certain point. The other thing is having a very um succinct process for interviewing. Like, is it 3 interviews? Is it 5 interviews? Who's included in each interview? Are there panels? Are there individual interviews? Are they virtual? Are they in person? Are we making sure we're asking each candidate the same group of questions? We have found too often different candidates get different questions. Oftentimes, women candidates are all asked way different questions than male candidates. And so it's really important that you have a very succinct, systematized process where you're asking the same questions. You're keeping whoever, at least 2 people in the room, one to record the responses, the other person asks the question, and the person that's writing the response is making sure that the person asking the questions does not go off script. So minimum of 2 people. So these are a couple of things you can do to start to remove the bias out of your recruitment process. When we look at internally for a promotion process, I always get this, and companies have been doing this for years. Like, well, we don't have internal talent that can do this work. And I'll ask, how do you know? Well, we went and asked department managers and directors and division leaders. And I will ask them, how many Black employees do you have in that division? They're like, well, I don't know. Well, how many did they talk to? Or how many women? And they can't tell me. I said, women especially Black women, get a lot of pushback when they advocate for themselves. So they may have the qualifications and the training, and their manager is not saying anything because they don't recognize or see them in that role because they don't look like them. So having an unbiased way to really understand and collect information on the training and the experience that all of your employees have, and not just asking a director or a manager who's the best. There's a bias within that process. And you really need to be balanced. What I want to say, balanced when you do that. You have to have a balanced process in there. And oftentimes there are gaps in there that are definitely problematic when it comes to being equitable in promotions. And so I'll share a couple resources we have about equitable recruitment and retention. And I shared, if you follow me on LinkedIn, I shared yesterday a guide, an employer's guide for the glass cliff. Has a check sheet in it that you can go through to get you started, as well as just the guide itself explaining what the glass cliff is and changes and actions and things you may want to consider after you do an assessment of what's going on in your organization. I know organizations, leaders like another assessment. Let me explain sometimes why it's good to do assessments. And because oftentimes you'll bring in a consultant like Positive Hire, me and my team, and we'll do an assessment, and you'll wait, and you'll wait, and you'll wait. I mean, it's 2 years later. At this point, you may have done layoffs, you may have done mass hiring, you may have done an acquisition. That then can change what the initial assessment found. I remember watching a 60 Minutes interview with the co-CEO of Salesforce. And he was explaining, him and his CHRO, Chief Human Resource Officer, were just doing a discussion about the gender pay gap. and how the CHRO at the time came to this co-CEO and said, "Hey, I think we have a pay equity problem." And the CEO goes, "How bad is it?" The CHRO goes, "I don't really know yet. I'm coming to you because I want to say I can investigate this and we'll resolve it because I don't know how bad it is yet." And he agrees that the CHRO can go do the investigation. She found a few million dollars, like $3 or $5 million in pay gap just in gender. What the CEO goes on to say, every time Salesforce acquired a new company, they had to do another pay gap analysis. And every time they would find a gap within gender from every acquisition. So when you do an assessment for your organization, a department, a location, a division, and you aren't taking action on it, things change. And after a certain period of time, or certain types of changes in your organization, you need to go back and do an assessment, even though you haven't done the work, because things change. And so you may find that your pay gap in 2020 was 5 million. In 2023 it is now 8 million. And that could be part to inflation, it could be other things as well. And so it's really important to act sooner on assessments and findings, and developing your strategy and taking action than later, because you now sometimes have to reinvest in another assessment. I know that's not what people want to hear, but it's it's is better for you to do a reassessment as opposed to going on a strategy that may no longer work for your organization. It's a lower investment in time and money to do a reassessment. So I'll stop there, and I want to get back into more of the data points. So if you have questions for me in the chat, I would definitely take those as well. So we were talking about the 10 top US based um, engineering and construction companies, or AEC, architect, engineering, construction companies. So we have Bechtel, AECOM, Floor, Jacobs, Kiewit, Turner, Sanska, DPR Construction, Gilbane, and Mortensen Construction. Yeah, I did say all. I think I said all three syllables in that. And so it's not, so as we're framing the discussion just on the executive side, we were talking about just what their attrition rates look like for executives at that level. We didn't talk about all of the attrition in the organization, but we did look at the percentage of executives each one of them have. Now, I want to go back and talk a bit about, while we have a bit more time, is the attrition rate of Black employees. The attrition rate of Black employees is ranges from 5% to 14%. And again, the rate is lower at the lower of at number 10, and it goes up to number 14. So Bechtel has the highest attrition rate of Black employees at 14%, while Mortensen is at the lower end at 5%. And so it's really interesting to see such a drastic change. And I wonder if it's a location, type of work, like why are we seeing attrition rates very different? Is there an impact by the number of employees as well? And so I think it's important that we start reviewing this to better understand. What we also see is a lot of underrepresented engineers go to smaller firms. They seem to have better career opportunities and paths and work that they like at smaller firms. And so there's maybe culture issues in these larger companies that they're continue to have issues retaining Black talent specifically. Okay. So we talked about the glass cliff. In the last few minutes, I want to really focus on ISO 30415, because when I say 3415, everybody thinks it's 3415. It's not. So ISO 30415. So that particular ISO standard is an international standard that provides guidance on diversity and inclusion in the workplace. It came out in 2021 during the height of the pandemic, but it had been being worked on for 10 years. It started over in SHRMS, Society of Human Resource Management, and then it switched over to ISO a few years later. When you look at ISO, it takes a different vantage point and a viewpoint on DEI, or diversity and inclusion, or DEIB, DEIA for accessibility, if you're not familiar with that. And what I mean by a different viewpoint, when we often talk about DEI, culture issues, everything is often siloed just to HR. Oh, that's an HR issue. That's what engineering and manufacturing and different parts of the organization will tell you. Diversity, equity, inclusion is an entire organizational issue. Everybody plays a part into this. And so it's really important to not have just HR on board and a DEI team, right? You need to also have engineering, procurement, contracts, accounting, marketing, right? Project controls, your analytics team, as some of you have them, IT, all of these different aspects. And supplier diversity is usually between, in construction, we either have supplier diversity and HR are the two areas they often focus on. But when you look at ISO 30415 specifically, is promoting diversity and inclusion throughout the organization, because it looks at the policies, practices, and procedures of the entire company in order to see how it impacts marginalized people throughout that organization. And taking that viewpoint is very different than what you're seeing in most other organizations and most other, what I want to say, most other parts of engineering construction. Most people are not, absolutely are not looking at other ways to engage with or even view DEI outside of diversity, equity, and inclusion. The chief diversity officer runs that, or uh, chief human resource officer runs that. They don't look outside of that. And I highly encourage you to change that viewpoint, because it becomes, it's more than that. It's not one thing or the other, it's all of the above. And it becomes an issue when you don't have it set up as such. And so utilizing that standard really gets you started. So I'm going to share a link in the chat with how you can get our guide for our ISO HR management DEI checklist. I'm also going to put in the chat our diversity recruitment and retention handbook. And that way you can also grab it and see how that works for you, um, as soon as I get this to work. So I'm dropping it in the chat now. And so you'll see that, whether you watch the replay, if you're reading the show notes, it'll show up in the show notes for you as well. Um, then, so just to recap, when we're looking at talking about engineering, construction, or architect, engineering, construction industries, there are nuances and difference there. I just wanted to frame the conversation around it first. And then also, when we're looking at and discussing the actual discussion around starting at diversity at the executive level, what are we really seeing? What is really going on in these organizations? And then how do we retain the executive levels and they're not set up for the glass cliff phenomenon, where they're set up to fail? And how do you change that? So I added some information about that, shared some information about that. And then we also talked about ISO 30415. Let me not say 3415, so people won't be confused. And that way you'll have that information as well on how to use that as a guide to really go through and assess your organization. So if you had it done, had an assessment done for your organization at the beginning of the pandemic, and you haven't taken action, I highly encourage you to try and do another assessment before the end of the year to see where you are. And that way you can kind of gauge which actions you want to take next year for your organization. I know a lot of people are more focused on ERGs and Black History Month programs, Women History Month. We're in Pride Month. That's great, but what does it do when you host these events? How does it make a cultural shift in your organization? And a lot of people are like, well, I'm still studying. There are people in your organization that said they're fatigued from learning about racism. Imagine having to live it for 30, 40, 50, 60 years of your life, right? Sexism, having to live it all of your life. And so while you may be fatigued learning about it, imagine what it's like to have to live that every single day. If you're tired from 3 years, imagine those that have done it for 20 times that, 15 times that, 10 times that. And so it's very important to look at it in a viewpoint of, okay, I've learned, how do I take action? One of the most common questions I get was, how do we go about creating a time a time wherein white people can ask these questions? And the questions they often have is, I don't want to get it wrong. And I always pause, well, what made you think prior to having this conscious realization that you don't want to get it wrong? How many times did you get it right before now? I said, so the question should be, how do I improve from what I had been doing and making that a journey of everyday conscious actions to take? And that takes away from the overwhelm, like, I don't want to get it wrong. What made you think you've been doing it right for 30, 40, 50, 60 years? Now it's like, how do I get progressively better? Right? How do I change my language, my thoughts? And those are things that you as white leaders and executives and managers have to do on a daily basis. So reframe that from getting it wrong to getting it progressively better, because it is going to make the journey much easier, but also it is a learning, is an action packed change, and not so much of, you know, um, fear of getting it wrong and not having a growth mindset. And you really need to have a growth mindset to keep in action in this space to make sustainable change. All right. Okay, so I think we have everything we've gone over. If you are looking for a diversity recruitment and retention toolkit, that is in the chat. We'll also have it in the show notes. We hope to also have the ISO human resource management DNI checklist that you can check. You can grab that guide as well. Oh, and I was supposed to put the glass cliff one in there. And so I will drop that in the chat as well for you to learn more about the glass cliff phenomenon. And you're like, well, I just thought they just weren't ready for the role. They may have literally been set up to fail. And I am just going to drop in my LinkedIn profile link for you to post so that you can grab the actual LinkedIn, um, the LinkedIn. You can just download it straight from my post. You don't have to get it from there. If you want to get the Glass Cliff one, that one's really easy. I shared it in a post and you can download it straight from the post. And just let me know if you have questions, but I'll drop this link in the chat as well. So everybody, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm Michelle Hayward, founder of Positive Hire, where we focus on connecting Black, Latina, and Indigenous women who are experienced scientists, engineers, and technology professionals to management roles. This is part of our Built by Women series, where we focus on Black women, Latinas, and Indigenous women for the most part, who are experienced scientists, engineers, and technology professionals, specifically in um, the infrastructure space. So they're in EC, engineering construction, and they're doing great things, whether it's from highway to um, design. What else are we doing? Oh, water, a lot of people in water, but EPA. So we're bringing in some great dynamic speakers every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern Time. So come join us, minus a few holidays that we won't be on. So everybody have a great week. I look forward to having you join us next time, and I'll be back on next week Wednesday. We have another phenomenal topic, and I cannot wait to have y'all join me. So everybody, talk to you later. Bye.